The morning the papers were never delivered. If you read drawn to the cases that still keep investigators awake at night, the disappearances that refuse to fade into history, then subscribe, like, and stay with me, because this one doesn't end the way you think it will. It was still dark when the first porch lights flickered on in West Des Moines, Iowa, September 5, 1982, just before 6 a.m. 14-year-old Johnny Gosch stepped onto the quiet suburban sidewalk with a canvas bag of newspapers slung over his shoulder. It was a Sunday route, thicker bundles, heavier stacks, more houses to cover before breakfast. He had asked his mother, Noreen, to stay home that morning. He wanted to prove he was responsible enough to handle the route alone. She watched him from the doorway as he disappeared down the street. It was the last confirmed time she ever saw her son. Minutes later, a neighbor noticed something odd. A blue car, unfamiliar to the neighborhood, was creeping slowly along the curb. The driver appeared to be watching the paperboys. Another young carrier would later report that a man had approached him, asking for directions. The stranger seemed nervous, scanning the street more than listening to the answer. At 6:15 a.m., Johnny was seen at the corner of 42nd Street and Marquardt Lane, folding newspapers and placing rubber bands around them. Then, silence. When Johnny didn't return home by 7:45 a.m., Noreen felt a flicker of worry. He was punctual, always. She drove the route herself. Newspapers lay scattered near the curb. Johnny's red wagon was abandoned at the corner, but Johnny was gone. No signs of a struggle, no screams reported. No witnesses who saw him forced into a vehicle. Just a quiet suburban street and a vanishing. Police arrived quickly, but the urgency that defines modern missing child cases did not exist in 1982. Officers initially suggested Johnny might have run away. Noreen refused to accept it. Her son had collected his route money the night before. He had plans that day. He left his wallet behind. And he would never leave his dog without saying goodbye. The search began anyway. Neighbors combed through yards and drainage ditches. Officers went door to door. Helicopters circled above cornfields stretching beyond the subdivision. The blue car became the first lead. Witnesses described it as a Ford Fairmont. The driver was a white male, possibly in his 30s, dark hair, average build, but no license plate was recorded. No sketch precise enough to identify him. The lead dissolved into rumor. Then another paper boy came forward with a detail that chilled investigators. He claimed Johnny had mentioned being followed on previous Sundays. A suspicious man watching him, studying the route. If true, that meant this wasn't spontaneous, it was planned. Detective Mike Shanahan stood in the Gosch living room days later, studying a map of the neighborhood pinned to the wall. Colored pins marked reported sightings, timelines scribbled in red ink. He had worked missing person cases before, but something about this one felt different. Too clean, too quiet, no evidence left behind. As if someone had rehearsed it. Meanwhile, Noreen began organizing her own search effort. Flyers with Johnny's smiling school photo were plastered across Iowa and neighboring states. She appeared on television, pleading for information. "Please," she said, voice trembling but determined, "if you know anything, call us." The calls came. Hundreds of them. Most were false sightings. But a few were unsettling. One woman claimed she saw a boy matching Johnny's description being pulled toward a car that morning. Another caller reported a suspicious man in a silver Ford asking about paper routes weeks earlier. Police investigated each tip. Nothing concrete. Then came a development that shifted the tone of the entire case. An independent witness, a neighbor, reported seeing Johnny talking to a man beside a car shortly before he vanished. The interaction didn't appear violent. It looked like a conversation. Trust. That single detail changed everything. Because if Johnny approached the man willingly, it meant the suspect might have used deception, authority, familiarity, a story convincing enough to lower a child's guard. Investigators began exploring a darker possibility, targeted abduction. The FBI joined the case. Files were opened. Similar disappearances across the Midwest were reviewed. Patterns began to form, or at least seemed to. Young boys, morning hours, minimal evidence. The idea that a predator could be operating across state lines gripped the community. And fear intensified. Parents no longer let children walk alone. Paper routes were reassigned to adults. The illusion of suburban safety cracked wide open. Weeks passed, no ransom demand, no confirmed sightings. Then, in October 1982, a call came into police from a man claiming Johnny had been taken by a large organization. The caller offered no proof, but he insisted this was bigger than one kidnapper. Investigators initially dismissed it as a hoax. Yet Detective Shanahan couldn't ignore one fact: the disappearance was too efficient, too silent, as if someone had done this before. Late one evening, while reviewing reports, Shanahan noticed something buried in earlier notes. A second suspicious vehicle reported near the route that morning, a two-tone car seen idling blocks away. The report had been filed but never thoroughly followed up. Why? He leaned back in his chair, frustration tightening his chest. Because if there were two vehicles, then this wasn't a lone opportunist, it was coordinated. And if it was coordinated, that meant Johnny hadn't just crossed paths with a predator. He had crossed paths with a plan set in motion long before that quiet September morning. And if investigators were right, the people responsible weren't panicking. They were confident, which meant Johnny wasn't just missing, he had been taken. And someone out there knew exactly where he was. By October 1982, the official search for Johnny had slowed. The headlines were no longer front-page news. Volunteers had returned to work. She kept binders filled with tips, dates, names, and phone numbers. She highlighted inconsistencies in police reports. She tracked suspicious vehicles herself. And then the letters began. Anonymous envelopes arrived with vague statements about trafficking rings and buyers. No return address. No fingerprints. Most were dismissed as cruel hoaxes preying on a desperate mother. But one phone call stood out. A man claimed Johnny had been kidnapped by a network moving children across state lines. He described an organized system: scouts, drivers, safe houses. The detail was chilling. Detectives were cautious. The 1980s were not yet the era of nationwide child abduction task forces. The idea of coordinated trafficking rings operating in suburban America sounded extreme. Yet Detective Shanahan couldn't shake the pattern forming in his files. Within a year of Johnny's disappearance, another paper boy vanished in Des Moines. Then another boy disappeared in Omaha, Nebraska. Different neighborhoods, similar ages, morning hours. No clear evidence left behind. Coincidence or coordination? The FBI quietly began comparing case notes. Still, there were no arrests, no ransom, no confirmed sighting of Johnny alive. Until something happened that would fracture the case into two realities. Years later, Noreen would claim that in 1997, 15 years after her son vanished, Johnny appeared at her door in the middle of the night. She said he was thin, exhausted, but alive. He told her he had been trafficked, moved between cities, controlled, watched, and then he left again before dawn. There was no police report filed that night. No physical evidence, just a mother's testimony. To some, it sounded impossible. To others, it confirmed the darkest fears they had held since 1982. Investigators were divided. Some believed trauma and grief had blurred the line between hope and memory. Others privately admitted they could not disprove her account. Because here was the truth that made the case so unsettling. There were gaps, huge gaps, early in the investigation. Several witnesses described suspicious men lingering in the neighborhood weeks before Johnny disappeared. Yet some of those interviews were never fully documented. One officer later admitted that the initial hours after Johnny was reported missing were not treated with the urgency they deserved. Roadblocks were not immediately set up. Vehicles were not stopped leaving the area. In 1982, the concept of an Amber Alert did not exist. Time was lost, and in abduction cases, time is everything. Then another disturbing detail surfaced. A private investigator hired by the Gosch family claimed he uncovered links between known sex offenders and individuals connected to local businesses. He alleged corruption, protection. Most of these claims were never substantiated in court. But the mere suggestion of a cover-up ignited national attention. Talk radio exploded with theories. Advocacy groups pointed to Johnny's case as evidence that child exploitation networks were real and organized. Whether those networks were directly connected to Johnny remained unproven. But the fear took root. Detective Shanahan revisited the blue Ford Fairmont lead. Records were incomplete. Witness descriptions conflicted slightly. No license plate. No physical evidence tying a suspect to the scene. It was as if the suspect had evaporated. Meanwhile, the second suspicious vehicle sighting, the two-tone car, led nowhere. The owner was never identified. Every path seemed to dissolve just before it could solidify. And then came the photographs. In 1984, 2 years after Johnny disappeared, a man was arrested in Florida on unrelated charges. Among his belongings were disturbing photographs of bound boys. One image appeared to show a boy resembling Johnny. The Gosch family believed it was him. Law enforcement could not confirm it conclusively. The suspect denied involvement. The photo became another fracture point, hope and horror intertwined. If it was Johnny, he was alive at least 2 years after his disappearance. If it wasn't, it was another cruel illusion. By the late 1980s, the case had shifted from a missing person investigation to something much larger, a symbol. Johnny's face appeared on milk cartons across America. His disappearance helped inspire legislative changes and missing child advocacy programs nationwide. But symbolic victories do not bring children home. Behind closed doors, detectives admitted the hardest truth of all. There was no body, no confirmed death, no definitive proof of life. Johnny existed in a space between, and that ambiguity fueled everything: hope, conspiracy, suspicion. Then, buried in old case notes, Shanahan discovered something that tightened his throat. A witness statement from the morning of September 5, 1982, describing not just one man speaking to Johnny, but another figure standing farther back, watching. 2 men, not one. The report had been filed, but it was vague. The second figure was described only as tall, possibly dark-haired. Why hadn't that detail been emphasized? If there were 2 men, then this was not a spontaneous encounter. It was coordinated, and coordination meant planning. Which meant Johnny had been targeted. As Shanahan closed the file that night, one realization settled over him like cold fog. If this was organized, then the people responsible were experienced, disciplined, and protected by something stronger than luck. Because for 15 years, not one of them had slipped, not one had confessed, and not one piece of hard evidence had surfaced that could tear the operation open. The case wasn't just unsolved, it was contained. And that possibility, that someone powerful had reason to keep it that way, was more terrifying than any conspiracy theory whispered on late-night radio. Because if Johnny had been taken by more than one man, then someone, somewhere, had helped them disappear. The silence and the legacy as fear spread across Northern California, investigators worked tirelessly to unmask the person behind the Zodiac name. Over the years, several suspects were publicly discussed, but none were ever definitively proven to be the killer. One of the most talked about names was Arthur Lee Allen, who became a primary suspect for years. Circumstantial evidence and witness statements raised suspicion, but no conclusive forensic proof tied him to the crimes. Even after his death, debates continued. Another name that later drew attention was Gary Francis Post, identified by a private investigative group decades after the murders. However, law enforcement agencies did not officially confirm this claim, leaving the case in uncertainty. Despite modern forensic technology, including DNA testing and digital code analysis, the Zodiac killer's true identity has never been officially confirmed. Some of his cryptic letters were eventually decoded decades later, but they did not reveal his name. Instead, they reinforced his disturbing mindset and desire for attention. The Zodiac case remains one of America's most infamous unsolved serial murder mysteries. It inspired books, documentaries, and the critically acclaimed film Zodiac, directed by David Fincher, which introduced a new generation to the chilling story. More than 50 years later, the case still captures public fascination. Was he hiding in plain sight? Did he escape justice entirely? Or is the truth buried in evidence yet to be re-examined? The Zodiac killer may have vanished, but the fear, mystery, and unanswered questions remain, making it one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.